Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are privileged today to hear the 7th Jerry Lee Lecture on Experimental Criminology, a lecture series created by the National Council on Crime Prevention to honor the original donor to the Stockholm Prize in Criminology, Jerry Lee. And today's lecturer, as you know, is Professor Keith Humphreys, who is the Esther Ting Memorial Professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the Stanford University Medical School, where he's taught since 1995. He's also served as Senior Policy Advisor for both President Bush II and the Obama administration in the Office of the National ONDCP, Office of National Drug Control Policy, also known as the Drug Czar's Office. He manages to spend the nice time of the year in California and then what passes for the nice time of the year in England as an honorary professor at King's College at the University of London. And at Stanford, he's also connected to some institutions that have a lot to do with what we'll hear this morning: the Center for Innovation in Global Health, the Neurosciences Institute, the Center for Health Policy, and the Stanford Law School. Keith is an experienced experimentalist. He's working on a number of projects, one of which is testing a method of reducing alcohol addiction called transcranial magnetic stimulation for the treatment of veterans with alcohol use disorders in the Veterans Affairs Rehabilitation Service. And this is a clinical trial that will evaluate whether this new stimulation reduces substance abuse and associated psychiatric symptoms. He's also leading a Cochrane collaboration systematic review of tests of Alcoholics Anonymous and other 12-step rehabilitation programs. And his publications include a study of mandatory sobriety programs for alcohol-involved criminal offenders in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine. On top of all of this, he's a regular columnist for the Washington Post, very short and insightful pieces that included a story about an evaluation of the 24/7 sobriety program in South Dakota by RAND researchers Greg Midgett, who is here today, and Bo Kilmer. And now he's going to tell us about a very big experiment indeed, if we have the courage to dare to know whether it work. And that is what he will tell us about in his radical drug policy change proposal to reduce crimes, arrests, and incarceration. Please welcome Professor Keith Humphreys.
Thanks, Larry. All right. Can you hear me okay in the back? Good? Good. Okay. Thank you very much, Larry. Thank you to the Crime Prevention Council. Thank you, Jerry Lee, for the honor of being here to give this talk that was created in your honor. So, as I said, we're going to talk about radical drug policy, by which I mean regulation of the drug called alcohol. All right, it's this thing here. There we go. I want to start by saying congratulations again to the co-winners of the prize. That was a terrific ceremony last night, and it was very wonderful to me to get to be a part of it. I've worked with one of the co-winners or known him for almost 20 years, I figured out last night, and I'm going to begin by a couple of bits of feedback from him that will inform what I'm going to say today. So Peter Reuter is, like me, a hardcore Anglophile, and so he reads The Economist, because if you don't read The Economist, you get kicked out. And I was talking to him at one point about an article we both read in The Economist, and he said, well, their editorial on that was completely incorrect, that's not the right way to analyze the problem. And I said, Peter, I'm shocked. I thought you got all your opinions from The Economist. And Peter said, no, I get my facts from The Economist. I get my opinions from the New York Review of Books. So I'm going to, in following along with Peter, I'm going to try to separate fact and opinion in this talk. The other Peter Reuter quote that informs me, he's a master of pithy feedback on your draft papers, and the last draft I sent him of a particular piece, here's what I got back. This will become a much reviled essay. Well done. And this may be a much reviled talk, but at least maybe my friend Peter will be happy with it. So I'm going to begin with, the Stanford Stumper, which is a question I ask students every year. Stanford students are very, very smart. They're smarter than me. They seem to know everything. And so I will begin when I teach a course on addiction or a lecture on drug policy. I'll say, tell me, what drug is it in our country that is involved in the most arrests, the most crime, the most violence, and the most imprisonment? And as smart as they are, they almost always say cannabis, which is virtually irrelevant on those points. And I say, no, it's not that. And they say, cocaine? Like, no. Heroin? No, no, no. Then they go through every obscure drug. And I reveal the answer, which is actually easily accessed information, and it's alcohol, of course, by a mile. Accounts for more of all those things in the US, and indeed in most countries, than all the other drugs put together. And the question is, why didn't they come up with that answer, given that they're so smart? And it's because they, like all of us, are trained not to think of alcohol as a drug. But when you do, it really changes your whole perspective on policy in this area. Another demonstration of this point is by Herman Lopez, who's a terrific journalist. He's one of the best journalists in the country covering the US opioid crisis. And he wrote a story for Vox, which is where he works, called "What If We Covered Alcohol Like Other Drugs?" And this was the photo from the story, appropriately lurid, like you might see on a coverage of a new drug crisis. But I'll read you a little bit from it. He's writing from New Orleans. An ongoing drug epidemic has swept the US, killing hundreds and sickening thousands more on a daily basis. The widespread use of a substance called alcohol, also known as booze, has been linked to erratic and even dangerous behavior, ranging from college students running naked down public streets to brutal attacks and robberies. Federal officials suggest excessive use of this drug has already been linked to 88,000 deaths each year, including car crashes caused by drug-induced impairment, liver damage from excessive consumption, and violent behavior. What's worse, public use of this drug has become widely accepted in some circles. In New Orleans, several men and women in their 20s shouted that they are going to get wasted, a slang term for coming under the effects of the drug. One law enforcement official said they have no control over their thoughts. They can't control their actions. It's a dangerous, dangerous drug. And I love that piece, and I really commend it to you because it's the best kind of satire, which is that fundamentally it's true. Everything he quotes in there is a fact. Why is it that when we think about drugs and we think about damage, we think about violence, do we not think about alcohol, which is right in front of us, with more deaths, for example, than the entire opioid epidemic every single year? So that's what I'm going to talk about, and that's what the talk's about. I'm going to talk about alcohol as a drug, heavy drinking as a very serious drug problem, why it is that we will not see it as a drug and see it as a drug problem, and then if we did, what would be the implications, what principles and what elements would you have in a radical drug policy towards alcohol? So we'll begin with it as a drug. What is a drug? Probably the best definition of a drug I've ever heard is it's any substance that when injected into a laboratory animal produces a peer-reviewed research article. But more medically, it's a meaningful thing to classify a certain set of molecules that are in the environment, some natural, some created, and they have characteristic effects on human behavior and the brain and the body, including things like memory and decision-making and emotion, and so on. And when you start putting things in that category, whatever you say, well, that seems to sound like heroin, that seems to sound like cocaine, you also realize, gee, that pretty much sounds like ethanol, alcohol. All the things we think of that really make something a drug. Do people get addicted to it? Yeah. Do they become tolerant such that they need more and more doses to get the same effect? Yes. Do they become dependent so that in its absence they have experience of withdrawal? For sure. Do we see changes in how they think and act and emotion and memory? Do we see neurological adaptation? Yep, absolutely. And is there damage associated, harm to the brain and the body? For sure. Yeah, it really is a drug. There's no way around it. It's just that we have, we being at least people in most Western countries, don't think of it as one. Now, right away, someone could say, well, wait a minute, why are you focused on alcohol, isn't everything you just said also true about the other legal drug we don't think of as a drug? And the answer is yes. And the only reason I'm not going to talk about that is this is a criminology conference, and the one difference is alcohol has a very strong nexus with crime, and tobacco, nicotine, not so much. So that's why I'm focused on alcohol. So what about heavy drinking as a very serious drug problem? As Larry mentioned, I spent a lot of time in the UK, including advising their government, and recently people have been asking me a lot about knife crime in drug markets. And that is a serious problem, there's no question about it. But one of the things I always bring up is, yes, there's this knife crime, and yes, it's horrible, and yes, there's maybe some nexus with illegal drugs, but there's 500,000 alcohol-involved assaults in England and Wales every year, and that is the biggest drug crime problem in the UK. What is other data that would persuade you this is a very serious drug problem? Well, I think one of the biggest ones is just what proportion of all human death and disease is attributable to alcohol. World Health Organization estimates it's 5.3% of all global deaths. That's really a figure worth meditating upon. So over 1 in 20 deaths on this planet attributable to alcohol. Also, disability, it's roughly the same contribution in terms of disability-adjusted life years. That's 4 times the impact of all illegal drugs put together. This is specifically the GB, Global Burden of Disease data, basically backing up that point. And you can see alcohol is, number 3? Impact is different, heaviest there in the middle income countries. Excuse me. But way more than, illicit drugs are right down there near the bottom of the list. And that's all of them put together. Remember, this is just one drug versus all those other drugs. It also is hugely important for crime, and it has a large causal role, underlying causal in producing crime. It is sometimes argued, well, the reason, criminals may drink more, but they would commit the crime anyway. We really know that's wrong. This has been demonstrated. You can demonstrate in the laboratory how people react under alcohol, how it changes their perception of threat, their aggressiveness, their level of inhibition. You can also see it in policy experiments, one of the best ones being from Finland, which has a nationalized alcohol monopoly, and the workers went on strike. And so Finland suddenly had a huge absence of alcohol, and among other things, there was a big drop in domestic violence during that period. You also can find this in taxation studies. When the price of alcohol goes up, violent crime generally goes down. If you look at studies of individual crimes, of people who are arrested and convicted of assaults on other people and murders, alcohol intoxication is not a majority, but certainly a plurality of people were intoxicated while they commit those crimes. That's something I bring up with my Stanford students when they're shocked that it isn't cannabis that's filling the American prisons. I point out for every person in prison in the US for all cannabis crimes put together, I mean up to the biggest traffickers, there's a dozen people in prison there for something they did while they were drunk. In almost every single country, drink driving is one of the most common classes of arrest. It's a huge part of what police officers do pretty much every single night. And it does drive prison admissions as well. I mean, there are plenty of people with drug problems in prison, but again, if you had to pick what's the most likely one when you meet a prisoner, and I've been in a lot of prisons, it's alcohol. This is some data on the UK, but I could have picked it from any country just on, kind of what proportion of violence is associated with alcohol as the day goes on and the night goes on, and you realize it becomes almost universal in the evenings. And it's an interesting thing. I encourage people who want to understand police work to ask any police officer how much of what you do after 6 o'clock each day is in some ways involved with alcohol. And it's very rare to hear a police officer say anything less than half. And in fact, one of my favorite responses was, what do you mean just after 6 o'clock? It feels like all I do is deal with alcohol. So you might think from that the alcohol industry is the credible political pariah. Who would want to be associated with an industry that produces a product that's connected with so much violence and death and crime and incarceration? But that is not the situation. Actually, the alcohol industry has enormous political influence all over the world. And the EU demonstrates that. So the EU had a push towards policy harmonization, having things regulated the same in each country. It might have, in a perfect world of public health and public safety, taken the stronger controls you see in this part of Europe and extended them throughout the rest of Europe. But really, it's been the opposite. There's been a substantial weakening of alcohol control in Europe through the EU, and that's due to the influence of the industry. In many, many countries, people who produce, distribute, and sell alcohol are among the most potent political lobbies, no matter how one measures it, whether it's donations, if those are allowed, or their ability to organize lobbying or advertising around political causes and so on. So it hasn't hurt them at all that they deal a drug that has all this destruction. It's even worse when you get into poorer countries. The level of corruption is pretty intense. This is a paper I'm proud to say we published in Addiction, which is the journal that I help edit. And it was a study of 4 sub-Saharan African countries with different languages and different cultures, and an examination of their alcohol policies, the law governing alcohol. These 2 researchers noticed that they were the same, almost word for word the same. And how on earth did that remarkable coincidence happen? And the answer is they were all written by the alcohol industry and adopted in those countries. And those policies are organized entirely around the promotion of commerce and the profit of the companies, and nothing for public health or public safety. And I have seen this in many other poor countries. I gave a talk in a sub-Saharan African country not long ago, and there was an enormous audience, and I was informed actually most of the people in the audience worked for the alcohol industry, and that my slides had been leaked in advance so that they could come up with criticisms to attack me in the talk. And then at the end of the talk, someone came up who actually worked in public health and said very meekly, "Can I have your slides?" They wouldn't give me a copy. And it's basically supplanting of what ought to be a government process, responsive in some ways to democratic will, with a corporate process. So why, gosh, that seems really bad. Why is it that we don't take this on when we talk about drug policies? And this brings up an unusual coalition of people that I'm going to describe. This is a nice quote by Bill. All right, and these are the four groups I would cite, which would be the alcohol industry, users of the drug known as alcohol, government, quote unquote, drug control agencies, and last, drug legalization activists. So start with the alcohol industry, and that's the most obvious one, why they would care. It's a big industry. People make a lot of money in it, both in terms of being whether they produce it or distribute it or they sell it. They own other businesses. They're big investors in tobacco. They have now become big investors in cannabis, at least in Canada. And their revenue is astonishing, $1.3 trillion US a year. And that's easy then to see how when they go to sub-Saharan Africa, they have enormous influence. Their profits are bigger than the GNP of those countries. Now, one thing you would say is, don't be too mean to the industry. They wish no one misused their product. I saw an ad on TV that said know when to say when. They encourage responsible drinking and so on. They'd be bankrupt without problem drinking. They are dependent on problem drinking. It varies country by country, but somewhere between 40 to 80% of the revenue for alcohol industry comes from people who have drink problems. This is a chart prepared by a friend of mine at the Post, Chris Ingraham, by a study of another friend of mine, Phil Cook, who's a researcher at Duke University. This is American consumption by decile, but you could show this in lots of countries. You can see about a third of people not drinking anything, then the middle group of people drinking not too much, less than a drink a week. Where is the money in this chart if you're a seller? It's really in the top decile, almost exclusively. That's where almost all your profit's going to come from. So, companies seek profit. That's what they do. If you want to have profits, you want that group on your far right to be as big as possible. You're not going to get rich off people who are down there in the middle. And so that's why it is not a plausible statement to say the alcohol industry is against problem drinking. They would really be in deep shape without it. But despite all that, they have a cultural status not typical of drugs, which really facilitates sales and products. Imagine if we all thought of alcohol as a drug and I showed you that same slide, how would you react? Or how would you react in a political hearing when we were talking about drug problems? I said, take a look at that. But the fact is that it is not regarded as a drug. It's regarded, okay, we used it last night, it was fine, there's no stigma associated with it. That benefits them. So of course they don't want alcohol thought of as a drug. But it's not just them, it's also people who use the drug known as alcohol. This is a scene from a movie. There's a very fine British miniseries called Traffic, with a K, about drugs, and I really recommend it to you. And a very good American film director, Steven Soderbergh, condensed it down into the length of a movie and made a very good movie, if not quite as good as the miniseries, but very good. And this is an important scene from it, which is the guy whose back is to you. That's the movie star Michael Douglas. He's playing the person who's going to be the White House drug policy director. And he's at a party, and this was really shot in Washington at a house of a Washington wise man named C. Boyden Gray. And they got real senators. Those are not actors. That's Senator Grassley and Senator Hatch to appear in this party scene. And the scene is ironic in that they're all together talking about the evils of drugs and how do we cut drug use as they consume double scotch after double scotch, getting progressively more loaded. And that is real. And if you go through the history of some of the most aggressive, drug-baiting legislators we've had have been people who were no stranger to the barman. And you got to think about it both politically but also psychologically. What would it be for them to think of themselves as heavy drug users? How would that change how they thought about themselves? How would that change about how they felt about the people that they are demonizing when they go out and say drug users are destroying society, when they realize, wait a minute, I'm a drug user. We now come to the self-confessional part of the talk. I am a drug user. Me, Keith Humphreys. This is a tweet. I'm also a Twitter. I'm just going to get it all out there. I'm on Twitter. I use alcohol. It's a pretty sad story. And this is a tweet I put out recently, and it just said, sipping gin and tonic on a beautiful London day will not solve the world's problems, but at this moment, it's solving mine. And I got many, many likes from colleagues, and I hope you're having a wonderful time, that I wish I were there, da-da-da-da, I didn't have to worry about coming back and having my department chair say, Keith, I need to talk to you about your drug use. I've heard some concern about your drug use. But if I'd said, on the other hand, sitting here on a day and smoking cannabis, or inhaling a ground-up Vicodin that I got from my doctor, it's really solving my problems, right? And so for me, it's quite nice that they don't think of it as a drug. Now, that used to bother me. Now I've kind of seized it and enjoy it. So I say sometimes, I am a drug user in discussion about drug use, just to rattle that up. And it was like, oh, were you making a big confession? I'm like, well, no. I mean, remember we all went out to dinner last night and we had wine? So we are all drug users. So let's talk about drug users and realize we're talking about us. But again, that doesn't feel good. To a lot of people. It's also true of drug control agencies that are charged with, you're supposed to solve your nation's drug problems, or the world's drug problems if you're an international organization. I'll give you two stories about that from Washington, D.C. The first one comes from an administration that I did not serve in, but I happen to know this is a true story, and there was someone who was charged with some drug policy responsibilities and was interviewed by a journalist during the crack cocaine epidemic and was asked, well, is crack our #1 drug problem? And he said offhandedly, well, alcohol is actually our #1 drug problem, but yeah, crack is what we're focused on. And the reporter put the first comment in the paper, and that person got a call from a political handler in the White House who said, you can either stop saying that, or you can resign. Second Washington story comes from when I was there, when I was working for President Obama. We tried to merge two agencies. The National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, as it's called, and the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which I saw as obviously connected to each other, and I soon discovered that there were many people who were very much against that. And it was really impossible to do, and people called me furious, angry friends of mine who do research. I'm not a drug researcher, I study alcohol. You can't put us in the same building. Of course, the alcohol industry didn't like it either. But anyway, the part to me that was, I got some, it failed, by the way, we were blocked in doing that. But my favorite memory from it is from a friend of mine who was very sort of a wily old Washington hand, and he was saying, well, the only way this will work if you want to combine things, you need to have an acronym to describe the new agency, a name that brings everybody together. And I said, well, what would be the name that everybody would agree to merge these two institutes? And he said, you should call it the National Institute on Bad Drugs Used by Minorities and a Perfectly Legal Product that Adults Have the Right to Enjoy. That would make one hell of an acronym. Anyway, it didn't work. But an acknowledged alcohol drug, it becomes fundamentally awkward, because you do have to explain this question of, opioids, it's a bad problem. It's terrible. I mean, we're losing more people than AIDS, and so we should be focused on that. But it's still less than the number of people, fewer the number of people who die from alcohol. And that would raise an awkward question. In the middle of the opioid epidemic, the US Congress cut the tax on alcohol. Well, if you put that all in one frame and said, if you're concerned about drugs, and by the way, a lot of opioid overdoses happen while people are also drinking, which makes it more likely, that would seem insane. But pretending alcohol is not a drug works for you. And clearly, pretending it's not a drug brings you political support. I mean, if most drug control agencies started talking about alcohol, or even, God forbid, tobacco, a lot of their friends in politics would abandon them. The next group, surprisingly, has an interest in this, are people who advocate for drug legalization. Because a lot of their core arguments rely on pretending that alcohol is not a drug and is also not a problem. So here are some slogans. Ending prohibition will end the violence around drugs. Well, the problem with that is, of course, that alcohol has enormous violence associated with it, and you could add to that enormous crime, enormous arrests, enormous incarceration, also corruption. That's a pretty awkward fact if you're claiming that the reason the problem's there is just because of prohibition. The war on drugs is filling our prison, but the thing is there's far more people in prison for alcohol-related crimes than drug crimes. Once we legalize, governments will effectively regulate the resulting drug-producing industries. They'll be good corporate citizens. 5% of global mortality? Good corporate citizens? Or to be wise, as one comment, we should regulate illegal drugs like alcohol. That would imply that alcohol regulation is a success, and I would submit this much death and destruction is not a success. So how do you handle that awkward fact about the legalized drug known as alcohol? You define alcohol not as a drug, and then you can just speak hypothetically about what it might be like if we legalize, rather than dealing, here's what it is like with a legal drug. This is what you get. So, that's a lot of opposition to treating alcohol as a drug. But let's say that we did. What would be the principles we would follow? What would be the elements of that policy? This is me reading my email. Really, this is a scene from a movie I like, Jimmy Stewart movie called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and so he's told in the Congress, you're fighting for a lost cause, and he says, well, lost causes are the most worth fighting for. Many people have said that, but I think about this. So I've just told you how hard it would be to convince people this is a big deal, but let's assume we could actually do that. What would we do to make a better society? So the principles would be following. First, we would say alcohol is a drug, as I just said, not an ordinary commodity. In other words, it's not broccoli, it's not tires on your car, it's not chairs. It's a substance that has enormous damage to the person who uses it, also has externalities on other people, and also importantly, it's a drug that, it's a product that changes how people think and make decisions, and so the normal idea of rational self-interest gets a little woolly. We would say industry self-regulation is a contradiction in terms. That's what a lot of countries say, the industry will regulate itself, but remember that chart on the distribution of alcohol consumption. If profits are connected to problem drinking, it's really silly to say, well, they'll regulate themselves. If they regulate themselves well, they would lose a lot of money, and that's not something they're going to do. Now, clearly, companies have a right to sell alcohol. It's a legal drug, but that should come with some responsibility that's not being met at the moment to recompensate the public for the negative externalities of the product, which are very large. We would also suggest using evidence, just be different in the making of policy about regulations. In quite a few countries, if you look at what they're doing, you put the list of their alcohol policies and what evidence shows, it's almost a complete inversion of what works and what is done. The big example is education. We'll do more education. The industry loves education, but that's the least effective tool that we have. And then the last thing is that good regulation would go beyond regulating the product to regulating political conduct. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And here are the elements I'd like to see. So first, system bullshit should rule the world. I'm in Sweden, aren't I? How fortunate that I praised your system. We would talk about advertising, political activity, how we would set taxes, what a minimum unit price is, how government agencies would act, and then I'll talk about people who have problems and want help, and people who have problems and don't want help. So I'm starting with why you guys should rule the world. That's, in Washington, there's an expression, a pander bear is a politician who always tells you what you want to hear, so that's my panda acknowledging that I'm in Sweden saying what you do is a really great idea, and that's a government monopoly for the sale of alcohol. Now, the government monopolies, when the government runs it, and there's different ways of doing this. It's also, by the way, it's been done in Canada. It's been done in some U.S. states, although fewer over time. But the idea is that, government has a different interest than a private seller would not do as much point-of-sale promotion, would not have 2-for-1 sales, would not have discounts, would card people, meaning, check IDs and make sure that, alcohol sales are not being made to 16-year-olds who look like 19-year-olds. What is the impact of doing this? Well, we have a very large literature on this, and international literature, and it's a very clear finding. When you have that government monopoly, the population consumes less alcohol. More importantly, they have less problem drinking, less drinking by young people, and less adverse consequences, things like drink driving fatalities. And so that model, which is really under siege, is a really good model that we would have as core to the handling of this drug. Second thing about advertising, we know a lot about alcohol advertising. It has been exhaustively studied, and it is known to work. It promotes use, heavy use, and youth use. It also increases interest in initiation, particularly people's first, young people who've never drunk wanting to start to drink. Now this should not, scientists have figured this out, but of course the industry figured out a long time ago that this is why they spend all the money on advertising, is because it works. And it's very good, and they're very good at linking it to cultural events that then end up translating externalities to other people. People drink more at sporting events where alcohol is heavily advertised. When they drink more, there's more likely to be a violent incident in a sporting event, so you suffer from alcohol advertising if you're not a drinker. To me, really shockingly, this advertising, which has little public good behind it, is subsidized by the public in a lot of countries, including my country. So if you launch a big campaign to promote your beer, that's a business expense. When you file your taxes as a company in the year, the public will reimburse you for that expense. It's deductible. I find that hard to understand the logic of that, but that's what it is. The restrictions that are set on alcohol advertising are pretty easy to evade, especially on the internet, and they are evaded. There's many studies of this. And one of the really nice ones, to return to sporting events, in some EU countries where you can't advertise alcohol on television, all you have to do as a company is buy the wall below the best seats at the football match. You put your beer ads on there, and then when people watch the match, they're watching an alcohol advertisement. And officially, you're not alcohol advertising. It just happens there's a television camera where you happen to place an ad. That's all. We would get rid of all that, I think, in Rad. We would say, you can sell the product, but there's no public interest in allowing it to be advertised, or we would make the advertising very restrained, and we would certainly not have the taxpayer reimburse you for promoting your drug. How much good would that do? Well, WHO estimate is, just looking at the EU, it would be about 200,000 life years of avoided disability and mortality each year from an alcohol outright ban. Now, what about political activity? In a number of countries, including mine, the alcohol industry gives money to politicians to run their campaigns where that's legal. They also do it in some places where it's illegal, probably. But even beyond that, there are countries where you can be a politician and have a consultancy with the alcohol companies, a paid consultancy, and yet sit on a committee that oversees it. So we would have to get rid of all that. That would have to just not be allowed. And again, they have a right to exist. They're legal companies, but there's no, you would have to say, because you are a product that is more risky, we need to take extra steps to stop the regulation of you being captured. It would also involve required disclosure of any industry support from pretty much anybody who engaged in lobbying. This is a real problem. Oftentimes if you've ever testified in a committee and you have, here's the alcohol industry, here's a public health person, here's concerned citizens of Upper Uppsala and who are very pro-alcohol, but what they don't say is, oh, by the way, we're basically funded by the alcohol industry. One would require that they have to do that. Research would be done differently. The alcohol industry funds its own research. They give out grants. Maybe some of you had them. You may notice there's always a restriction on those grants that you can't study problem drinking, but you can study the positive effects of alcohol if you like. I would not allow that. If they want to fund research, that's okay. They should make a donation. They can give it to the National Medical Institute or whatever, and then let that body independently decide what would be studied about alcohol, rather than using it as a form of public relations for them. Now, what would be the benefit of this? I can't prove that there's a benefit to getting rid of corruption and regulatory capture because it's never been done. But I'm willing to give it a try. How about you? How would we set taxes? Well, taxes would have to be set to compensate for harm, which they're currently not. One example would be we would always index excise taxes for inflation. After the end of prohibition in the United States, for example, some states set taxes at a specific value. So I think, if I remember right, the Missouri tax was 1/2 penny per pure gallon of ethanol. That was set in like 1934. And then it just stayed there at that level for half a century. And inflation ate away that till it became an utterly meaningless tax. So anytime you tax something, you would index it and sort of get out of this trick, and this has happened with federal taxes in the United States too, of setting them at a flat amount, and basically that's effectively cutting taxes every single year. The amount of tax would be equal to the estimate of harm. There's lots of ways to argue about modeling and harm estimates. I agree on that. It would be a fraught process. But the harm estimates usually you see is about a US dollar per standard drink, something like that. It varies by drink and beverage and so on. But you can look at even states that impose high levels of taxes are way less than that harm. And so what that means is you as a taxpayer are picking up all the rest of that harm yourself. And it shouldn't be that way. If you want to sell a product and it's legal and your product does an average of this amount of harm, you need to pay for that harm, not the public. I'll skip the point about hypothecation just for time's sake. But Phil Cook's estimate is even a 10% price increase is estimated to cut mortality 9 to 25%. It's quite a high return on this. And that's what we would get. Yeah, we'd have to pay higher taxes if we drink, but on the other hand, there'd be a lot fewer bodies lying around. An alternative or a complement to taxing a portion of harm is something called minimum unit pricing. And this is used in Canada. It is now being used in Scotland after a very long regulatory fight with the industry. And what that is, it says that you just can't sell alcohol below a certain price. You think, why does that matter? Well, work by people like at the Alcohol Research Group in Berkeley has shown that the people who drink the most bargain shop. They pay about 80% less per unit of alcohol, per beer, per glass of wine, whatever, which makes sense, right? If you drank every single day, you would have a lot of interest in figuring out what is the cheapest way I can get my alcohol, whereas if you drank once a month, you probably wouldn't pay much attention. And the industry caters to this group by producing very high strength, very low cost beverages. It is true in the UK, for example, that there are shops where you can literally buy alcohol for less than bottled water. There's a lot of harm connected to those beverages. What a minimum unit price says is it's not a tax, it just says you just can't sell it that cheaply. You have to charge at least this much. The most bargain basement products, the super high, have to be at this price. It doesn't affect merchants that much. They sell fewer volume, but since the price is higher, they do okay. And it has very large effects. So the Sheffield Group, I have a Purse House piece there, people like Petra Meyer and John Holmes as well, have modeled showing, at least in England, a 50 pence per unit would save about 3,000 lives and about 40,000 disability-adjusted life years a year. There's really good data from British Columbia on this as well, where they've had it as policy for quite a long time. That would become standard in a radical alcohol policy. Drug control agencies would have to change, and they would all have something to do with alcohol. We would have no more drug strategies that did not mention alcohol. We would not have pronouncements about drugs that did not emphasize that alcohol is in fact a drug. We would not have separate science agencies that study drugs and alcohol as if alcohol weren't a drug. And, and also as scientists, we would also have to change. I mean, a lot of things are actually not on purpose, but end up being very deceptive when we do studies of drug users, and we don't report the fact that a huge number of them also use another drug called alcohol, and that affects the harm of the drug use that they have. You can end up with conclusions that are really quite inaccurate, that would have to all be put together. And then what about people who have problems, of whom there are many? Well, there's not much help out there for them. In wealthy countries, there are services for alcohol use disorder generally, but most studies would show you they're undersupplied, even in Western Europe, where you have nationalized health insurance. And when you get into low and middle income countries, they're grossly undersupplied. So, that is not acceptable. I mean, when you look at that 5% mortality and 5% global disability, you would note that, well, there's lots of other diseases that have less mortality and less harm that we invest a lot more in. So we have to make a comparable investment in services for people who wanted treatment for their alcohol problem. The treatments we have are imperfect, whether they're behavioral or pharmacological, but that's also true of many treatments for chronic health problems. And still, you get on average, you get drops in use, drops in harms to themselves, and drops to harm to other people. So it's certainly a reasonable policy from a public interest viewpoint. And the studies that have been done, at least in developed countries, US and Europeans, and also Australian, is you get substantial crime drops and public health benefits when you expand access to alcohol treatment. Those are people who want treatment. What about people who don't want treatment but have an alcohol problem? Well, mostly you're going to find those in the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system, actually, although it punishes alcohol crimes, sometimes savagely, it doesn't do much to help people stop drinking. And this is an opportunity that could be exploited. I mean, one place to do is treatment in prison, although the evidence on that is not that great. I think the real cookie are all the people on community supervision. So people who are living in their homes and working their jobs or whatever, but they're being monitored in some way. And monitoring very rarely does anything effective about their drinking problems, but drinking problems are epic in that population and are criminogenic. They are part of the reason why people reoffend. Something we could do about that much more are what's called mandatory abstinence programs. And what are those? Well, what they are is it's where you use the leverage of a court to stop someone from drinking. And the one place where this is done, South Dakota in the United States, the rules are the judge will say, you've been arrested for drink driving for the 5th time, and I could lock you up in prison, but I'm not going to. Instead, you can stay at home, you can keep your job, but you can't drink for the next 6 months. And I'm not just going to tell you that because I know it wouldn't hold. Instead, you're going to have to submit to a regime. Every morning, you're going to have to come in and blow a breathalyzer. And if it's negative, you haven't been drinking, you can go about your day. If it's positive, you'll be arrested. Not probably, certainly. And not in the future, but right at that moment. And we will impose a consequence. Happens to be a modest consequence. You'll be held in jail overnight and let go the next day, which you wouldn't think would matter too much because this population has spent a lot of time behind bars. But it's unlike most things the criminal justice system does, swift and certain, and it's quite motivating. So South Dakota has done over 10 million breathalyzer tests in this program. The proportion of those tests where someone has shown up and blown negative is actually 99.1%, which is pretty remarkable. There's different versions of that. The US versions tend to be 24/7 sobriety, which is working, I think, in about 15 states at the moment. The UK has it. I was involved in getting that passed through Parliament. It's called alcohol abstinence monitoring requirement. It doesn't matter what you call it, but it's just using these principles to help people with drink problems or in the criminal justice system stop drinking, but also give the public a measure of protection from them, their families a measure of protections of them. What do you get from that? Well, RAND research led by Greg Magette, who's here, and Bo Kilmer and Nancy Nicosia, studied the South Dakota experience and showed that counties that did this had a 12% drop in drink driving arrests. Incredible, that's the county figure, not just the figure for the people being monitored, but the entire county. That's how large the individual effect was. And wonderfully, a 9% drop in domestic violence arrests. And that's really striking because these folks were not generally arrested for domestic violence. They were arrested for drink driving But when you get into a population of people who's arrested for drink driving 3, 4, 5, 6 times, they are people who do other things when they drink that we don't want people to do, and one of them is they are violent towards their families. That's a substantial benefit, and that's probably why they showed a statewide drop in mortality, more generally, for everybody, not just people in the program, but the state as a whole. In the UK, it's been evaluated less rigorously. There certainly hasn't been any kind of randomized trial, but we did a pilot in South London with substantially better results for probation supervised people than are normally achieved by the UK system. So this is really, I think, an underexploited way to reduce crime, to reduce incarceration, oddly enough, despite the fact that people can go to jail in the program, they usually don't. And more importantly, since they're less likely to reoffend, they don't end up in prison, which is where the long sentences occur. And also at the same time, you're reducing alcohol misuse. So it's really, the win-win-win, I would say. So, summing up my radical drug policy proposal, we would say alcohol is a drug. It's in a lot of people's interests to pretend that it isn't, but it is a drug. Some of the interests people have in pretending are psychological. I just don't want to think about myself that way because I use alcohol. Sometimes they're cultural. Sometimes they're economically based. Sometimes they're ideological. Weirdly enough, some people who think of themselves as political opponents in different countries, maybe the people would say, you're the extreme legalizer and you're the extreme drug warrior, actually agree on this point of let's not talk about alcohol as a drug because that's complicated for both of us. And they share that with each other. And I'm just here to bring people together and see their common humanity. So I just wanted to raise that point. But those are barriers. All these things are barriers. The economic barrier, the industry doesn't want thought this way, but that should not deter us from trying to make radical reforms in this area because the gains in public health and public safety are potentially just absolutely enormous. A radical policy would take the assumption the alcohol industry sells an addictive drug, not an ordinary commodity. That means the industry needs to be much more heavily regulated than it is in its price and how it sells things and how it's allowed to promote its drug and how much political influence it's allowed to have. That would be hard to achieve, but remember that 5% figure of all global deaths and you realize it's really worth it to go for this. The benefits could be extremely large. Frankly, I think the largest benefits in drug policy may be right here with this drug that we call alcohol. Thank you.
We will sit down and have a conversation with the audience. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Keith has agreed to take questions, and we have people with microphones who can help you out. And an alcohol researcher from United Kingdom, Dorothy Newberry-Birch, will start the questions.
I thought that was amazing. I thought it was really good. I'm Professor of Alcohol and Public Health Research at Teesside University, and we did the SIPS research that showed that brief interventions can have an effect on reoffending. So I was just blown away by this. I just love your slides, so I can just pretend that I wrote them for some conferences.
You're very kind, thank you.
So I have two questions. One question is, I'm Professor of Alcohol and Public Health Research, but I'm also a criminologist, and I'm told to pick a side very often. So when I worked in the School of Health, they told me that I was a criminologist, and now I work in the school with criminology, and they tell me I'm a public health researcher. And I spend my whole time telling people that they're not separate identities. They're one in the, we're social scientists that look at this. And I wondered if this was something that you'd had as part of your career.
Well, yeah. I mean, in fact, that's kind of embedded in the talk, and you can even see that that's partly why it's easier to persuade people alcohol problems are a health issue because it's not illegal. And yet when you try to persuade them that cocaine addiction is a health issue, no, that's crime. This is a health conference, and so on. So I've struggled with that really my whole career in trying to get people to see the fact, the commonality that These are molecules, and it's silly to cut up the world that way, you know.
Be between us, we'll change the way. But my second question...
Let's do that.
My second question, sorry, very quickly, is around...
Only two.
Only two. I could stand here all day. My second question is, there was a programme on the TV in England last weekend about how much it would cost the industry if we all drank within recommended limits in England. And it was £10 billion a year. And I think you're absolutely right, that's the big issue here, why we can't get more from these people.
Well said, thank you.
Thanks very much, Dorothy. Other questions? And I know that we have our hostess last night from the presentation from the City Council. I'm wondering maybe if she wants to ask about the idea of mandatory abstinence as a penalty, even under the Swedish regime, which is so good, but can it be even better?
Well, you did put me on spot. I was actually considering this. My political field has been social policy, and in Sweden we do have a lot of voluntary programs for alcohol abuse, and very few mandatory ones. It's basically if you've the care of children that you must submit to alcohol abuse, but having this be a voluntary issue and not considered a drug is really a problem, especially when you have the care of children, and as we know, there's a lot of socialt arv, inheriting your parents' abuse issues. Where would we start to implement these policies?
Thank you for that question. So, to clarify one thing, so many courts around the world use the power of the court for someone who's committed an offense now, right? So these people threaten public safety. They say, go to treatment. Go to somebody like Dr. Humphreys and he'll counsel you. And then they hope that the person will stop drinking. And so the fundamental shift here is you're saying, let's use the power of the court to get them to stop drinking and offer them treatment, for sure. But the way they win the game is by changing their behavior, not by talking to somebody like me. Because everybody in my racket has talked to people who are court mandated and will nod their way through the sessions and say, wow, this is really great and helpful, and you're a terrific doctor, and can we wrap up soon because the bar opens in about 10 minutes and I don't want to be late. So it's partly it's a thinking change of like the power you have over someone, which you got because they threaten people in some fashion, you use to focus on not a process, but an outcome. The other point I'd say about children, the people who love 24/7 sobriety the most in South Dakota are family court judges. Because the toughest call for a judge or a magistrate is, do I put a parent I'm worried about back in the home with children or not? And the person, may pledge, I promise I won't drink and violent, I promise. And the judge has to think, okay, I really want to believe you, but then if you hurt your child, then I'm going to, feel terrible. The great thing about these mandated programs, it gives them a way to know. And say, I'm not just going to tell you not to drink. I'm going to say, you're going to be tested every day. So if you do drink and your kids are at risk, I'm going to know. And the sentence is going to go away. And on the other hand, when you come into court again, when your sentence is ending, instead of just having to testify, I promise you I didn't drink. Oh no, I have the data right in front of me. So it's great for family court. I mean, it's really terrific, and those people actually became very strong advocates of this because it makes their lives much easier.
Keith, quick follow-up on how the testing is done. You showed us a picture of people showing up to an office, taking a breathalyzer test. What's the story on skin conductance to get your blood alcohol content by the internet? Yeah,
so most of the South Dakota thing was in person, but you have people who live way far away, they can't drive in, and so what they use then is a bracelet that can measure, or an ankle bracelet, but that measures the metabolite of ethanol in your perspiration. And this is what the UK does. And for that, it'll just keep track, it tests all day long, and then it's uploaded over the internet, and then the police know is Keith obeying the rules or not, and they can intervene, you know, no matter where. I can't hide, you know, basically, you know, wherever I drink. So that's another way to potentially do it, particularly in rural areas where it's hard for people to come in. Yeah.
Okay, Mike Levy from University of Cardiff had his hand up over here. Thanks. Somebody get him a microphone. Be great. Thank you.
Yeah, in 2000 I did a project in Newport in Wales on the prevention of alcohol-related violence. And one of the things we were going to do was to have a free bus service after midnight for those who didn't want to stay and fight. It had to be free, otherwise the bus drivers would be assaulted and the thing would call to an end. It failed because the local newspaper ran a story, lager louts get free bus service home. And that just killed the project. I just wondered what the aftermath was of the South Dakota stuff, because it's an area I haven't looked at in the US. Did other jurisdictions pick it up and run with it, or was the resistance futile?
All right, thank you for that. In response to the first one, the way to sell those programs is to point out that people who drink a lot are also very likely to be assaulted, right? So you know, in my university, we have a free ride service because we know there are people who will prey on people who are leaving parties who are drinking, and so there is it's not just about lager louts, it's about everybody, right? On the second point, so South Dakota, they had a hard time getting it started, and the guy who invented it, his name was Larry Long, county prosecutor, he found 3 judges who said, I'll give it a try, and he didn't know this at the time. It turns out they were all in Alcoholics Anonymous. And so they kind of knew the drill, right? And once they did it, you know, it was very pleasing for them because these people stopped cycling through the court. The jails, local jails started to empty out. The sheriffs were happy. And they started to then tell other judges and sheriffs. And so it spread throughout the state. Then he became the state attorney general, which is, you know, the top cop of the state. And then other states nearby started doing it. So North Dakota, and Idaho, and Montana. And then, so the cookie was finally, at the end of the Obama administration, we have a big highway bill every 5 years, which is, you know, everyone puts all the things they want on this because you have to have highways, and the federal government gives them money. And that included money for people to do this, to improve road safety. So like I say, I don't know the exact, I can't quote you the number of states that are doing it statewide. I think it's at least 15, it might be like 20. And other places are probably, Greg Magette probably knows the answer to that if he's here. And then when I was in the UK, you know, it was created about 2012, I think, is when that law was passed, and it's just being piloted around. But there's a lot more places that could use it, yeah, including in the UK. Yeah.
Great. Professor Lozell from University of Erlangen and a former winner of the Stockholm Prize in Criminology.
Very much for a very convincing and inspiring talk. I have one question because I read some economic papers on at least some positive side effects of heavy drinking, because heavy drinkers die early, though they do not cost the society all the illnesses we normally have when we get older. Is there some sense in that? I do not know the literature very well, but I read it sometime.
Yeah, I know the literature you're talking about. It's the most famous paper, I think it's titled The Wages of Sin, and it focuses on smokers. And it makes the argument that, well, they die in their 50s or 60s, they don't use their pension and that kind of thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, right. But, you know, even whether, I'm not a tobacco researcher, I don't even know if that holds up for tobacco, but I'm sure it does not hold up for alcohol, because the externalities someone imposes are so costly through all that period. The amount of health care they use, their likelihood of injuring other people, their likelihood of getting involved in criminal justice. So I'm quite sure we're not coming out ahead financially on people who have drink problems. Yeah.
Great. Maybe one more question before we break up. And if not, I can't think of anything better to do than to call on our winner, one of our 2 winners this year, Professor Peter Reuter of the University of Maryland. Peter.
I should confess to being one of those who has separated alcohol from all my work. Phil Cook, an alcohol researcher who'd never written about illegal drugs, and I wrote an essay together for Addiction 10 years ago on the basis that surely there was something we could share from our separated interests. It has never been cited to my knowledge, so perhaps we did not learn anything from each other. Is it important that society believes that there is legitimate pleasure to be gained from alcohol consumption, but not from any of the other drugs? And even if we legalize marijuana, we sort of are not quite conceding that that has some acceptable benefit to it.
Mm-hmm. I think that is, you've made explicit something that is implicit in what I said about the status of alcohol. It's clearly, because all drugs produce pleasure. That's why people use them. At least in the, obviously you can ruin your life with drugs, but no one would take them if they didn't feel good, at least in the short term, right? And that is acceptable with alcohol for sure, and is considered evil if you happen to get pleasure from a drug that is illegal. And I think another benefit would be thinking about all that in the same frame. If we're going, at least for fairness, right, nothing else, we could decide, or society could decide, the negatives are so strong, we're not going to fool around with something like your pleasure because people are dying. Or we could say, pleasure matters a lot, it matters this much, but we would impose that equally on people who happen to like different drugs, and not say, my pleasure is a right, and your pleasure is a crime.
Well, thank you very much. Let's express our appreciation for Professor Humphreys. And I may say that this concludes this year's Stockholm Criminology Symposium. Next year, we're going to meet in exactly the same week, but to confuse you, it'll be a different day. We're actually going to start on the Tuesday of the second week in June in 2020, if you want to mark your calendars. I'm not going to tell you anything more about what will happen, except when it's going to happen, and I hope to see many of you there. Thank you so much for coming to honor Peter Reuter and Ruth Dreyfus, and especially today for the Jerry Lee Lecture in Experimental Criminology, for the biggest experiment we've ever heard in this lecture series. Thanks again, Keith.
Appreciate it, man.